Let me just first get your reaction to this latest news about the Russians maybe moving their forces to Donbass and not focusing as much on Kyiv and other major cities. I think a lot of us in the West, and probably certainly in Ukraine, are desperate to see the outlines of an off-ramp for Putin and an end to all of this. How much should we take heart in this latest intelligence that maybe Russia is moving away from a broader offensive in Ukraine and beginning to think about an exit strategy?
Well, it's potentially positive with some really big caveats. Alex, at the beginning of this war was always the question, well, what is Russia's intent? And one idea was that they were just going to focus on the Donbass, on eastern Ukraine, and perhaps try to take Mariupol and connect the Donbass down to Crimea, which they also control. Unfortunately, tragically, the barbaric situation that unfolded was the more maximalist Russian objective, where you saw them trying to take Kyiv, saw them essentially trying to conquer the country, and you saw rhetoric from Putin about denazification, demilitarization that suggested the real aim here was regime change in Kyiv in a kind of Russian-controlled circumstance in Ukraine. Given all the losses they've suffered, given the consequences that they've faced, given the resilience of the Ukrainian people, what may be happening here is Russia retreating from those more maximalist objectives to that smaller objective. Now, the problem, though, Alex, is that is still a massive violation of Ukrainian sovereignty.
Yeah.
That is still a permanent danger to the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine, in Ukrainian land. So while it is less than what Putin might have sought at the beginning, even if they truly are climbing down here, they're still trying to do something that the Ukrainians could never accept and that would leave millions of people in danger of Russian subjugation.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the question, right? Like the smaller piece of the pie is still a piece of the pie that he doesn't deserve. So what's the guidance for the West? I mean, just Donbass is not acceptable, and yet everybody wants an end to the maximalist carnage. So what's Biden to do in all of that?
Well, I think when it comes to the negotiation, the guidance to the West is take the lead of the Ukrainians. You know, what the Ukrainians can accept, they get to decide what they can accept. And I would expect that the Ukrainians are going to insist on sovereignty, and things like giving up the Donbass are going to be things that are difficult, if not impossible, for President Zelensky. That said, you've heard him talk about things like giving up on NATO membership and accepting NATO neutrality. Russia's made demands about recognizing Crimea. He may not want to do that, but I think, that obviously has been a status quo until now. I think the sticking points are going to be if this is where the talks lead, if Putin basically tries to establish some degree of control over the full Donbass and Mariupol. And that, keep in mind, Alex, that not only connects Crimea up to the Donbass, it cuts Ukraine off entirely from the sea. So these are things that I think will go beyond what Ukrainian red lines are in negotiations. But I think the role of the United States is to back up Ukraine. And whatever positions they want to take at the negotiating table, those should be our positions.
The stakes of this aren't just what happens to Ukraine and what access does Russia have to various parts of the globe. I mean, Biden put it in very stark terms today, which is effectively, are democracies going to prevail, or is the world going to be run by autocracies? I mean, and that is a theme that you've explored in your book as well. When you couch it in those terms, it offers very little room for negotiation, right? I mean, this is really, Biden is positioning this as a fundamental fight between good and evil. And I just wonder how complicated that makes the diplomacy around it.
It does make it more complicated, but it happens to be the reality, Alex. And look, things have been moving in a negative trajectory in terms of democracy in the world for some time, but there are these fault lines. And there are these fault lines, particularly around the two chief authoritarian systems in the world, Russia and China. Ukraine is the fault line along Russia's border, a country that wants to be a democracy, that doesn't want to be subjugated by Russia, with this enormous threat bearing down on it. China has its own fault lines, including Taiwan, where the people there want to be a democracy, don't want to be part of China. I think part of what's so notable is there is a contest between democracies and autocracies, and the people who should get to decide have made clear where they stand. Ukrainians could have just submitted to Russian domination, or those Russian speakers that Putin said he was coming to rescue could have welcomed that. They did not, because they don't want to live like that. They don't want to live under the thumb of a dictator. They want to have self-determination. They want to have sovereignty. They want to have their own democratic system, and they want to be connected to other democracies. That's the message that exudes from President Zelensky and everything that he says. And we've seen similar things, by the way, in places like Hong Kong and also in Taiwan. And so I think President Biden's right. Like, this is about the future of the way in which governments, societies, and the international order, how that is going to be organized going forward. And if we live in a world in which people who want self-determination can be subjugated, it's going to be dark days ahead for democracy.